Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Office Hours. This is episode number 57, 57, big 57. And in today's episode, as in the episodes of yore, I will be answering one at a time 3 of your game mastering questions submitted by you or someone very much like you at my website, www.adam-koble.com. There's a little link at the top. It says Office Hours. If you click it, there's a form. Fill that form out. Hit that submit button and get in line. It's time for Office Hours. Today's first question comes to us by way of a beleaguered Shadowrun game master. A Shadowrun game master struggling with niche.
Hi Adam, my name is Alex, or ArsonCat on Twitch. I'm GMing Shadowrun on Roll20 and we are about 12 sessions in. The group has the traditional setup of a fighter, a shaman, a matrix specialist, and a face. We seem to have run into a problem of uneven spotlight distribution. Shadowrun gives players quite a lot of freedom in how they want to approach a problem. The party does extensive recon before the action phase, longer than a session, and most of it turns out to be social when we play out dialogue with NPCs. What we consistently see is that the face and the mage roll for a lot of checks and make visible progress, while the decker makes maybe 2 rolls of any real impact in a 5-hour session, and the combat specialist mostly sits in the van in case of emergency, which so far has never come. Now, the fiction the PCs create has internal logic. It makes sense for the decker to find NPCs who might have information, and it makes sense for the face to engage them and extract this information. The PCs seem to be working together, but the mechanical side of this fiction leaves 2 players sort of underrepresented. In this legwork phase, how would you engage the non-social PCs in a way that feels natural and not like an artificial obstacle for the sake of making them roll some dice? Is that even the GM's responsibility, or do you think the decker and the fighter players should be more proactive? Thank you, and have a great day.
So first of all, ArsonCat, what a weird situation to be in as far as Shadowrun goes. Like, I feel like Shadowrun game masters who are listening to this question are sitting there thinking, if they're anything like me, wait, what? You're playing a Shadowrun game in which the social characters are the one getting all the spotlight, and the guy with the gun is stuck in the van? Now, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. I'm just saying that's an aberration. That's not, in my experience, how Shadowrun tends to go. More often than not, it's the other way around. It's the face that is mechanically not supported, and the gun bunny that gets to steal the spotlight. So, kind of fascinating situation that you found yourself in. But I want to go back a little ways, and I want to talk about kind of the broader problem at hand here, and how it plays into role-playing games generally. So there's this thing that we have in role-playing games, not just Shadowrun, but in D&D too, for example, where characters develop a specialization. They develop something that they're very, very good at. We call this a niche. And in Shadowrun, niche gets developed fairly deeply. Whether it's because of clan or class or character archetype, there's a design desire, right? If you're making a role-playing game, you want to create distinct character roles in a group environment. This is because it can be, or be perceived to be, less fun when everyone can do the same stuff, necessarily. Homogeneous characterization in role-playing games tend to lead to a lack of character engagement, which can lead to a lack of interest in a game, which can make a game seem badly designed, right? If everybody is more or less the same, if we all have the same abilities, the game can feel like we're not special. And a big part of playing a role-playing game is the specialness of our character, right? This is why we tell stories about my character and the cool build that I did and my special ability. So it behooves designers to make cohesive group units in a game, right? A Shadowrunner team, a D&D party, a gang in Blades, whose overall goals reflect the intended play of the game, right? Adventurers all go on adventures. It's why in Dungeon World they share all the basic moves. That's both what the game is about and what the characters in the game do to engage with the world around them. Vampires in a coterie might differ in their individual skill and attribute dots, but they all suck blood. They all suffer from humanity. They fear fire. They die from sunlight. In Dungeon World, the first thing that separates my adventurer from your adventurer is our class, right? You're a petty proletariat, and I'm a bountiful bourgeois. No, you're a wizard, and I'm a fighter. But the thing is, being a wizard is a subset of being an adventurer. And being a wizard gives you abilities that supplement your adventuring. You particularly tend to solve your problems with your wizard tools. You wizard them away, right? In Vampire, I might be playing a noble Toreador, and you might be playing a fiery Brujah, and that's our class structure in that game. I get Toreador tricks, and you get Brujah ones, and we're both vampires, and we share our vampire stuff. So the game, in effect, can be said to be about, or at the very least, the intent of the design is furnished unto the players by things that all the characters have in common. So maybe this is an interesting experiment. Try this later when you have a minute. Go to your shelf of role-playing games, take a book down, flip through it, and look at the imaginary Venn diagram of character action. In the game in question, what are the things that all of the characters have in common, right? What is the thing that you cannot help but be competent at in that game? What things are specific only to particular archetypes? I would posit that the things that everyone has to be able to do is really fundamentally what the game is about. All the other stuff is optional supplementary material for accomplishing that thing. Obviously, this sort of assessment tends to be easiest when you look at games that codify their archetypes. Games that use class, clan, playbook, splats, essentially. When we say splats, we're referring to I'm using RPG oldster terminology. A splat is a reference to how an asterisk on paper can look like a splattered bug. And splat books were like Clan Book Tremere, Clan Book Ventru. We would write them in places like Usenet as asterisk book when referring to the anyway. This process is easier still in games like Apocalypse World, where the basic moves are laid out for you. Apocalypse World is about those basic moves. Now, it's much harder to do this with, say, point buy or priority systems of character creation, but you can get an understanding of the game's intended space by looking at shared options. Which brings us to Shadowrun. Now, Shadowrun used to treat character archetypes as the default thing one would do when one played Shadowrun, right? In first edition Shadowrun, you were a rocker, you were a merc, you were a shaman, you were a mage. There was an optional character building tool, but de facto, you were meant to pick the archetype and then maybe adjust it a little bit. As Shadowrun developed, these previously semi-optional systems of prioritizing and spending points became the preferred method, leading up to where we are now in 5th edition Shadowrun with a massive pile of choices that go into building your character. Now, I'm not bagging on this method of character creation specifically, but what it does end up doing is it gives the players the ability to be either quite broad or incredibly powerfully niche. The desire to be niche in a game and to have skills that nobody else has is often referred to in design or play as niche protection. Sometimes niche is enforced by character creation. Sometimes niche is rewarded. If you look at, say, Torchbearer, niche skill building is rewarded by the MVP award. Having the right skill in the right moment, being smart enough to have chosen your niche correctly, that's rewarded. Niche protection can exist in terms of things like games allowing only one playbook of a certain type, right? There's only one angel. That niche of being the angel is now protected by the rules, right? Restricting certain skills or abilities to a particular class are also a function of niche protection. Tremere blood magic only being available to Clan Tremere, at least initially. If you want to get some, you can Diablerize them or whatever. Niche protection at character creation, right? Multi-classing, the inverse of niche protection, allowing characters to expand broadly over the territory of other characters, is the inverse of niche protection. Now, in Shadowrun, there is a little bit of niche protection built into the rules. You have to opt in to magic, for example. Essence management is a form of niche management as well. The more you lower your essence, the more you're opting out of the magic niche. That word is beginning to lose its meaning. The way the game is played, however, the culture at the table often drives people to character guided rather than mechanically guided niches. And when you focus your character creation on a very, very specific set of abilities, a highly hyper-focused character at the expense of all your other abilities, we have a name for that. Do you know what that name is? We call that min-maxing. Min-maxing is, according to the good folks at Giant Bomb, the character building strategy of maximizing a specific desirable ability, skill, or other power of a character and minimizing everything else seen as undesirable. The result is a character who's excessively powerful in one way, but exceedingly weak in others. Crusher was min-maxed. Night Sass, not min-maxed. Shadowrun is, in my experience, the high queen of min-maxing, or if not the queen, certainly a member of the nobility, because outside of very specific strategies or, I don't know, RP-focused character creation, there's almost no reason to supplement your character with off-brand abilities. Excuse me a moment, I'm going to close Skype so that JP stops bothering me. This is what happens when you're forgetful. Here goes. There we are. Now, where were we? Sorry, students. So anyway, outside of very specific strategies, or you're building your character around your RP, there's no reason to say buy magic and cyberware together. There's almost no reason to have a few dice in something when someone else in the character has a bunch, right? If your companion has 6 dice in socializing, there's really no reason for you to have 2 dice in socializing, right? This kind of gestalt character creation where characters take on a sort of Voltron-esque approach to building their team tends to hyper-competency in a very narrow field. Usually, Shadowrun characters have no inherent niche protection from the design of the game, right? Nothing in Shadowrun really says like, all right, only one person can take this skill, but socially derived niche protection emerges from an intent to be a team player. You want to be a functional and useful element of a larger organism. I mean, just consider literally one of the character roles, social character roles, it is called the face. You're the face. Someone else has to be the fist, right? Because Shadowrun grants no base competence in the things that one might assume to be core behaviors for Shadowrunning. There are no basic moves in Shadowrun, right? Stealth, the ability to shoot a gun, the ability to drive a car, basic understanding of corporate security protocols. You can end up with characters who are unsuited for all but the discrete situations for which they were hyper-engineered. Characters who are not good Shadowrunners, but incredibly good at blowing things up. Right? You can have one specific thing you can do and nothing else. The inherent but utterly emergent, which is to say not inherent to the mechanisms but to play itself, structure of the game is as follows, in which Shadowrunners obtain a mission, engage in mission foreplay with the setting, engage the mission, are betrayed by Mr. Johnson, engage in a daring escape or battle, and then somehow manage to make some money. Our highly evolved super niche characters will more often than not be able to apply their skills only to very specific aspects of that structure. right? Quoth Stevie Nicks, thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. Now, Stevie was obviously not a very good meteorologist, but the thing here is that characters in a situation that often emerges in Shadowrun really only matter when it's their turn. When the narrative presents them an opportunity in which to do the thing for which they are built. Now, solving this problem is harder than assessing it because the game does what a lot of games made in the 80s and 90s did, or rather never did. And that's give you any kind of mechanical structure to operate inside of, or advice at all for pacing this stuff out mechanically. There's no, in Shadowrun, there's no obtain mission phase. There's no foreplay phase. There's no betrayal phase. Like, these things are supposed to just happen freeform. You're meant to play the game moment to moment, eliding time as you see fit, and so you end up in this situation where a character is built under the presupposition that they're going to get to blow up some enemies with their big gun, but unless you give them enemies to blow up, or unless the face fails to talk their way through the situation, they're just sitting in the van doing nothing. So compare and contrast to Blades in the Dark, whose cycle of free play, crime time, and relaxation give a clear indication of what the characters are doing when. This character's structure can be seen in a perhaps less polished than Blades, but more cyberpunk mold if we look at the Sprawl. Now, in the Sprawl, looking at the moves, we can see very clearly who's meant to operate during what phase of a very codified structure of play. Now, there's no such luck in Shadowrun because character types are much more freeform. The game itself has no way of knowing if anyone in your group even has the gun skill, and so can't include a shootout phase because you might all get murdered. That's bad design. So Shadowrun won't help you. You're going to have to help yourself. And so this is where we just get back to that universal point of addressing this problem with your players, right? Talk to the players about their characters. If they're complaining they don't get to do anything during certain parts of the game, they have the opportunity to play something different, don't they? Right? They're the one that made Hard Trog the Gun Bunny, and they need to acknowledge that their time to shine should come up, but that because there's no structure in Shadowrun, your minimaxing, your decision to become hyper niche is a gamble. Now, I guess the responsibility here falls on you to structure your mission such that everyone gets a bit of spotlight time, but the problem is that mechanically, if we look at the rules of Shadowrun, it takes 10 minutes to get through a conversation, mechanically, and 2 hours to get through a gunfight, sometimes. Now, if your players aren't complaining, but you're feeling the urge to include them, it might be that you're imagining a problem that doesn't exist, right? Like, if this is bothering you but not them, then your only responsibility is to yourself, right? If you want to see more of their characters in play, give them opportunities to interact with NPCs or the other players in ways that won't fuck up the mission if they fail a roll, right? It may not be mechanically optimal, but you never know how an NPC who takes a liking to the giant idiot with the assault cannon might be fun or useful down the line. The problem here is that the game has a laissez-faire approach to character creation. It says you can do whatever you want, you can be whoever you want, build your character in whatever way you like, take whatever skills you want to, don't take whatever skills you want to. Socially, we build into roles, right? We're building a team. It makes sense. We should have someone who can deal with magic, someone who can deal with gunfights, someone who can stealth, someone who can deal with vehicles, a decker, whatever. We have all these roles that we assume belong in a Shadowrun team. We're all relying on the shared lie that the GM has any guidance to include those things. So because there's no structure, you might just have to do that yourself. So bring up opportunities for the characters to use their skill. Recognize that because of Shadowrun, there's very few opportunities where the whole group is going to get to do everything all at once. This is why a face will often throw 2 or 3 dice into shooting. Because when the guns come out, Yes, they're not going to contribute that much, but at least when it's their turn, they don't just say, I take cover, right? They can pop off a shot or two, but the game's not going to help you, right? Niche protection, once it's turned on, means character's going to be one or two good things and a whole lot of bad things. Shadowrun washes its hands of the problem. You're going to need to go to your players and say, listen, if you want more screen time, you need to make yourself more useful by buying different skills, or we're all going to find other ways narratively to help you contribute. Niche protection, niche engagement, min-maxing, that stuff's not bad inherently, but the trick is that you got to play a game that will help you with that. Take a look at Torchbearer. Take a look at the Sprawl. I'm not gonna tell you they're gonna work for you, but they're at least gonna show you an alternative. And I've said this before, but I can't wait until we get a cyberpunk skin for Blades in the Dark. I absolutely can't wait. I think it's going to show us some really interesting new ways to look at cyberpunk fiction in RPGs. Let's talk about fiction, actually. Let's talk about fiction in RPGs. Our second question comes from Joe Rog. Let's see what Joe Rog has to say.
Hello Adam, Joe Rock from Twitch here. I have been reading a lot about story structure and storytelling recently, and even though the books usually address screenwriters or novelists, I couldn't help but read it with a tabletop context in mind. Now, I know that in a role-playing game you don't have the same power as an author over their book, and that forcing a story onto a game is generally not a good thing. But do you think there may be a right way to approach role-playing games from a story structure perspective? I was thinking of, for example, mechanically rewarding players for creating compelling midpoints, plot twists, climaxes, endings. So, do you have any thoughts on that topic? Are there any games out there that do this kind of thing? Thank you very much.
So when we think about stories, that is to say, static, non-improvised, traditionally oriented storytelling, like movies or TV shows or books, when we think about the things that they tend to give us, there's a wide and varied selection of narrative development styles that we can be inspired by. Usually, though, and most simply, we tend to gravitate towards fiction that contains predictable structures, right? Beginning, middle, end. We go looking for the satisfying triad of setup, conflict, and resolution. New setup, new conflict, new resolution, etc., etc. We expect when we watch a TV series or a movie that we'll be introduced to the characters, we'll see them come together, we'll see them drift apart, we'll see them deal with crisis, and in the end, they'll overcome some climactic thing, and we'll be rewarded with the denouement. Now, there's all kinds of variation in terms of the way these are presented, right? We might get our climactic thing set up before we're introduced to the characters, then jump back and find out how we got there. We may be served up false endings or twists and have what seems like a climax be merely the midpoint in a larger conflict. Now, all of these tricks and structures of traditional storytelling rely on a unidirectional, controlled, authorial experience. By which I mean someone or a group of someones in the form of writers, producers, directors, cast, and all the other rad humans who make up a piece of media. Someone is in control of the story and is serving the story to an audience who absorbs that story. The narrative that we talk about when we play role-playing games doesn't exist in this media, any of them. They do not have narrative. Narrative in the way that we've defined it for the purposes of office hours and the way that I talk about role-playing games simply cannot exist. There's no ongoing imagining of the world. The world is already imagined. Just because you haven't finished reading all 17 books in the Chlorban Continuum series doesn't mean the story doesn't already exist, right? There's no playing to find out what happens because it's already happened. Even if the author hasn't written the book yet, by the time you get to absorb it, it will have happened. There is no present tense in fiction. Now, we're still drawn powerfully to these structures because they're all around us, right? We constantly absorb the idea of rising action through media, and we reproduce those things or seek to reproduce them when we tell each other stories. And I really do think that role-playing games being compared to writing at all does a degree of disservice to role-playing games. There's so much more than writing a novel or making a TV show can ever really be, because both of their collaborative nature and their beautiful unpredictability. Think about it this way. In a novel, the author must set in stone each and every word and step along the way. They might have co-writers and editors, but ultimately there's a finished thing that is served up once it's done. The interaction between author and audience is effectively null. As an audience, you interact with the novel, not the author. Something like fan fiction is an attempt to bridge this gap. Favorite characters and settings are repurposed and reused. Original characters are added in to canon material. The worlds and stories are bent and twisted into sometimes unrecognizable shapes by artists of homage, lovingly or mockingly attempting to interact with the author's creation in a way that's just not possible without creating ourselves. In RPGs, there's no struggle, right? Or there shouldn't be. We are at once author and audience, and all fans of our fiction created together, right? We're both appreciating and making at once. Which is why role-playing games are so magical as a form, as an art form, right? I think that we do this disservice when we expect or hope for our RPGs to fit into the traditional models of authorship. The idea of rising action, the inevitable horrific twist, clean endings. When we demand these things of our play, we model a free and protean organism into a fictional straitjacket, which is fucking ironic for me to say, given how much time I spend modifying my GM style to fit into 4 one-hour slots with a 5-minute break between them, sorted into weekly episodes in which I utilize cinematic language to create compelling scenes. I get it, I'm a big old hypocrite. But I think that unless the game itself is structured that way, we're struggling, or at least weirdly hacking one of the key elements of RPGs, and that's the freedom from constrained narrative expectation. No matter how satisfying a clean narrative arc might feel. But games as fiction, games as entertainment, is a whole other thing than games at the table. No matter how satisfying a clean narrative arc might feel, I think we can get something else from our games instead. I think that we can find a different structure, one that, by the rules, are engineered to get good play and positive experiences out of our players. I love games that take that risk and force structures of play onto you, phases in which to explore and deal with specific stuff. Burning Empires has this, for example. Mouse Guard and Torchbearer learned it from Burning Empires. Blades in the Dark has this structure. Lots of cool games, and I'm sure you can name a few that I don't... Fiasco, someone mentioned in chat earlier. A lot of cool games say, when you're in this phase of the game, use these rules and it will create this sort of narrative for you. I mean, hell, to a degree, even Dungeons & Dragons does this. Demanding that the players roll initiative signals a change in the narrative. We have entered a scene of action and left a scene of inaction. Get ready to use your action skills, everybody. Get ready to think in 5-foot squares because we've moved into a different phase. Right? Mouse Guard has the player turn and the GM turn. Dungeons & Dragons has the fight and the not fight. So I don't think that trying to use novel writing techniques to improve our games is the way to go. I think it's possible to tie in plot twists and climaxes and what have you using the reward structure of the game, but I think it's better to look for games that have their own narrative structuring tools to make them good role-playing games. If you're interested in the intersection, and I've talked about this game a little bit before, I'd love to play it. I just have never found the opportunity. I'd love to play it for you. If you're looking for the intersection of role-playing games and media in a role-playing game designed to ape and mimic media, look up Primetime Adventures. I think that it will be an interesting experience just reading it if you're interested in this topic. So Primetime Adventures, go check that game out. I don't know. I have fond memories of it, and for a while, it was the apocalypse world of the tabletop scene, right? Everybody wanted to make a game that was derived from PTA, but I don't know. I can't remember if it's any good. We'll have to do a deeper dive sometime. None of this is to say that understanding traditional or classic or even avant-garde story structure isn't a useful or cool thing to do as a game master. It absolutely is. Knowing how stories structure, knowing what people expect from structured stories, knowing some of the ways that things can be done can be helpful. But just don't go looking for ways to mimic it necessarily unless you have a game that will support you in doing so.
Hi, Adam. My name's David, and I'm currently running a Stars Without Number campaign. A different group I'm in, with no overlapping players between the two besides myself, is asking me to GM a campaign, and I would like to run it in the same Stars Without Number universe that I've already built. My question is whether you think it would be better to have the two campaigns coexist in the same timeline or place them in alternate universe versions of the same system. I worry that if they are in the same timeline, then NPC and world changes instituted by the first party will disrupt and confuse my new group, making them feel as if they've already missed a lot of the action. But on the other hand, I feel that if I put them in different timelines, maybe taking something away from my original party by writing them off as non-canon, and bore myself by returning places and people to their base state, even though in my head they've undergone changes. What would you do if you were in this situation with Sector Asgard Sigma from Swansong? Thanks for your time. I'm a big fan.
So this kind of thing is too awesome not to do. And I think you've nailed down most of the salient stuff about what trouble you might have on either side of the yes-no equation here. I'll share my experience a little bit and my thoughts on the matter, but I feel like you've got a pretty good handle on the risks and maybe just need a bump in one direction or another. So to me, this sounds way too awesome not to do, right? This sounds so fun, and I think you should do it. I love the idea of multiple parties in the same world. It just tickles my continuity bone to think about a universe in which multiple parties are moving around messing with each other indirectly, which I think is the key, that indirect bit, but we'll get to that. I think with one game master and multiple groups, if you're capable of taking a lot of notes and being smart, I think you can do it. Some examples of intentional and more or less synchronous play you might be interested in checking out are Balance of Power, right, which I ran, or John's games of Roleplay Blades and the Bloodletters campaign on my channel and in his YouTube. I think you can definitely do it, and it's super rewarding when one group interacts with the things that the other group did, but it's difficult because continuity is a slippery fucker, and it can get away from you pretty easily. If you have one group blow up a planet that the other group is on, well, you're kind of screwed, and the blown up planet group is going to be intensely unhyped that they didn't get any chance to do anything about it, right? Additionally, since you're not in control of a powerful group of threats in the universe, which is to say your PCs, you can't do things like the whole soft move warning trick. The atomic planet fucker might come out of nowhere, and your group might show up and be like, well, you're all dead, so sorry. I think it can be a heck of a thing trying to manage the two groups operating at different speeds as well. You know, a Gygaxian level care when keeping a calendar is super important for a game like this. Characters will get out of sync with a few trips through drive space. You have to be willing to elide, right? To be like, all right, 10 days pass for you. What are you doing during your downtime? Let's catch up with the other group, right? Let's try to get you aligned. Essentially, though, what you're looking at is a slightly constrained game that requires a little foresight. Now, what I would suggest is that no matter what you do, no matter what happens, do not pit the groups directly against each other. At least, unless you want to delay the game if one group gets too close to the other, or you're willing and able to have both groups on super double emergency standby in case a melee or space battle becomes necessary. That being said, don't worry so much about it, because Stars Without Number is a great choice for this kind of game. Because you have some control over what the players are up to, right? You can feed them missions that don't run directly counter to one another. This is why Balance of Power worked the way that it did. Republic High Command and the Imperial Intelligence Office were handing out missions designed by me to keep the players sort of apart, but interacting indirectly. The other thing that you have to your advantage is the universe is a big-ass place, right? There's lots of room to goof around. Make it so that it requires a drive of significant ability to get from one corner of your sector to another. If all your planets are one hex apart, just nudge a few of them and have like the north sector and the south sector, so that it is a big deal by the time they interact. And by the time they're capable of interacting, maybe they'll be big enough to participate in the faction turn. Because one space in which you can give them some agency to directly fuck with each other on a wide scale is the faction turn. Consider, if you're interested in scaling the game up, just starting there. Make the players' characters a part of a faction that the players can control. That way, they can directly interact on a large scale with monthly in-game turns, giving them a chance to pit Cyber Ninja against Demagogue. Otherwise, just tell the players that while they're in the same universe, they're likely to see the effects of each other's actions. They're probably not going to end up in a big shootout with one another. Certainly not without some planning and anticipation, some ramp up. Get them to buy into that idea. Get them to not... Because if you don't have this conversation, I promise you, there's going to be a player in your group who actively tries to find the other group. They're going to hunt them down, and they're going to try to fuck with them, and that's not going to be fun for you. Don't let them do that. Get them to buy into the idea that it's separate, but in the same universe. And I bet you're all going to have a lot of fun with that setup, right? The players ought to delight in the idea of wondering if the other group is behind the various plots and setbacks they encounter, and it'll make the between session hangout bullshit so much more fun, right? That was you that did that? Right? That's really fun. The other thing you can do is just get them to all buy into the same organization. If they don't butt heads, they're never going to need to worry about each other, right? They'll actually be able to all work together to bolster the same faction. And if you do that... Now, instead of having 2 groups of 4 players, you have 1 group of 8 players that you can mix and match for any given mission. And if you keep going that direction, why not 10? Why not 12? Why not 16? Why not 30? You could be running a West Marches style Stars Without Number game so easily. Right? Now, you've got a bit of a challenge ahead of you, but I think with the right group, you're playing the right game. So you're halfway there already. Big uncaring universe, fragile PCs, working through larger proxies might work out for this sort of play. Now, I think really you've got a few options, but one of them is not playing 2 groups in an alternate universe version of this. Because you said it yourself. It's going to be really dull repeating yourself as they end up in similar places. Also, if you're anything like me, incredibly difficult to keep straight which NPCs belong to what universe, who is alive and who is dead where, what planets are at what place. You're going to have to do 2 separate faction turns. It's save yourself the tedium and just put them both in the same sandbox. I promise, it'll pay off when they start kicking over each other's sandcastles from a distance with nuclear weapons. sandbox campaigns. They're my favorite. I think they're great. This has been episode number 57 of Office Hours. You can get involved with Office Hours by going to www.adam-cole.com, clicking the Office Hours link, and submitting a question. I will be working my way through them 3 at a time every week, Tuesday morning or Thursday if you're watching this on YouTube. Thanks for coming, everybody. We will see you next week after the Penny Arcade Expo for episode number 58. And if you've been waiting with bated breath for Office Hours Hot for Teacher, don't worry. It's back to school season, everybody. We're going to be starting Hot for Teacher probably sometime in the next couple of weeks. You can submit your questions for that slightly saucier show in the same way. Just go to adam-cole.com, click on Hot for Teacher, and submit your questions. Sharpen your pencils. Polish your notebooks. We'll see you next week for more Office Hours. Bye, everybody.